I think, first of all, you have to be there for the right reason. You have to be there not for the fame and glory and recognition and being a page in a history book, but you have to believe there because you believe your talent and ability can be applied effectively to operation of a spacecraft. Whether you're an astronomer, or a life scientist, a geophysicist, or a pilot, you got to be there because you believe you're good and you in your field and you can contribute, not because you're going to get a lot of fame and whatever when you get back. So that motive has to be there to start with, and then you have to be a fairly dedicated, objective individual saying, okay, it is going to be dangerous, and I'm going to spend my time worrying about what I do and practicing what I do if things go wrong. And in doing that, you take that initial attitude of believing you can do it, and you build a lot of confidence because particularly in the simulators, if you respond to 2 or 3 horrible emergencies during the course of a morning and do that day in and day out for weeks and months, it's a tremendous confidence builder. Some people could probably say it's brainwashing in its best form, but there's a total confidence at the time of launch because of the initial attitude and because of the training philosophies, coping with contingencies. I think all of us certainly believed the statistics which said that probably 88% chance of mission success and maybe 96% chance of survival. And we were willing to take those odds. But we wanted to be sure that if there were any failures in the machine, that the man was going to be there to take over and to correct it. And I think that still is true of this business, which is basically research and development, that you probably spend more time in planning and training and designing for things to go wrong and how you cope with them than you do for things to go right. I think I ran the whole gamut of emotions, really. The concern started when I woke up an hour before I was supposed to because I started going over in my mind the mental checklist about where do I go from here, what do I do. I'm not sure that I ever remember eating anything at all, but getting into the suit, going through the physical and so on, that was all rote, that we'd practiced that so much. That I was ready for that. The excitement really didn't start to build until the trailer, which was carrying me with the spacesuit, with the ventilation and all that sort of stuff, pulled up at the launch pad. I walked out and looked at that huge rocket, Redstone rocket, for the first time. Of course, it's not huge by today's standards, but it seemed pretty big then. And I thought, well, now there is that little rascal, and I'm going to get up on top and fly that thing. And you know, pilots always go out to the airplanes and kick the tires before they fly. Nobody would let me get near the rocket to kick the fins, but I kind of walked around and thought, well, I'll take a good look at it because I'll never see that part of the machine again. And then the excitement started building, I think, at that point. Fortunately, in my case, after I was strapped in and ready to go, basically, we had a hold because of a had to change a generator in the Redstone rocket, and I had a chance to sit back and relax a little bit and again go through the process of what do I do for the first few minutes and first few seconds of the flight, and so I was really pretty relaxed by the time that liftoff finally occurred. I guess my pulse really wasn't much over about 110 or so. I've forgotten exactly what it was, but everybody thought I was a pretty cool customer. But at that point, you're basically thinking about what do I do if this goes wrong? What do I do if that goes wrong? You know what critical things have to happen in sequence. In some cases, the fact that you're accelerating with the thrust of the rocket, that's good. It's very positive because you know the rocket is doing its job and it's doing it correctly. But it's it's just going over a checklist of one after the other. You've done the simulator so many times. A sense of being excited, you don't have that really when the flight is going on. Excited before, as soon as a liftoff occurs, you're busy doing what you have to do. I remember just reaching the apex of the trajectory when I was going to be in the middle of the weightlessness, and I was looking at the periscope, and all of a sudden I said, you know, somebody's going to ask me how it feels to be weightless, so you better pay attention to how it feels to be weightless. So I was going through the motions of flying, but at the same time trying to assess physiologically how I felt, and was I dizzy or confused and so on. And then I thought, well, somebody's going to ask me how the Earth looks, and so I looked down through the periscope, which is all we had at that point, and made a few remarks, I think, on the tape or perhaps on the radio, the view which I could see, my ability to. And I said, well, now I got to get ready for re-entry, so enough of that subjective thinking, and get back to the objectivity required to get this baby oriented to come back in. So you can see you really go through a whole gamut of feelings, of nervousness, of elation. I mean, obviously at that point I was delighted the rocket had worked perfectly, and all I had to do was survive the re-entry forces. And you do it on a fairly, like on that flight, a rather short period of time, just 16 minutes as a matter of fact. Of course, I was delighted the flight was over, but I still had to worry about cleaning up inside the cabin. I had to worry about what the hatch was going to be, how to get in the sling, and so on. In the helicopter, flying back to the carrier and seeing thousands of sailors on the deck of the carrier, being a Navy pilot, having made hundreds of carrier landings already, was sort of like coming home, except that there they were cheering for me, and that was probably the really first moment in the flight when I felt the emotion of success, perhaps pride in what I'd done, and that was probably the first emotional moment of that whole flight. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Of course, I was delighted when I was assigned command of the first Gemini flight with Tom Stafford as my co-pilot, and it was shortly after that that I developed a disorientation problem in my ear, and NASA grounded me, and I was grounded for almost 6 years. Didn't like it at all. Didn't like it at all, but the prediction was that this problem, which is called Meniere's syndrome, causes dizziness, nausea, lack of balance, so on. In some cases was correctable, and I said, well, of course, in my case, it is going to be correctable, obviously. And the NASA guy said, well, we like you, Shepard. You can be in charge of all the astronauts. You can't fly, obviously, but you can fly with somebody else. Whenever I flew, I always had to have somebody in the back seat of the airplane. But so I was sort of in administrative charge of the astronaut group and their training and so on, and send them down, pat them on the head, and watch them fly. That was a little tough. I finally found a gent who corrected my ear problem surgically, and after NASA looked at me for perhaps a year, decided that I was well enough to fly again. And at that point, I had some influence in the crew selection, so I was able to work out a deal where I could fly on the lunar mission. The deal I tried to cut with NASA was to give me command of Apollo 13. And they said, oh, no, we can't do that. You're too much of a political problem. And I said, well, no, I've been training along with all these other guys, and I'm ready to go. And they said, well, we know that, but the public doesn't know that, so we'll make a deal with you. We'll let you command Apollo 14 if you'll give us another crew for Apollo 13. So Slayton and I gave another crew, and of course 13 was the one that had all the problems on the way out, the big explosion, you remember, the cliffhanger and coming back. So apparently I was getting some help from outside sources. Oh, we got all kinds of flack from the guys. the first place, I hadn't flown anything since 1961. Here it was 10 years later, right? And the two guys with me had not flown before at all. So they called us the three rookies. I mean, we had to put up with that. This was an internal description, obviously. And then the fact that everybody said, well, you know, old men shouldn't be up there on the moon. And there was, not that there wasn't enough challenge to prove the point as it was, but that was part of the makeup of all those guys. And still, you know, they're still a pretty competitive group. But it was you know, again, the gamut of emotions, the gamut of feelings. Of course, it was stretched out. Instead of being 16 minutes in Freedom 7, it was stretched out to 10 days in Apollo 14. And there were obviously, during the translunar and the trans-Earth phases, a couple of days, almost 3 days, when you really could relax. There were obviously tasks of navigation and unstowing and getting ready and so on that had to occur, but really some chance to look around and see what the Earth looked like and really get used to zero gravity and really relaxed, right, pleasant moments. We had a couple of cliffhangers on Apollo 14. In the first place, we tried to dock with a lunar module, and that didn't work, so you know, it could have been the end of the deal, but we finally got that organized. And then the actual landing on the surface, we were supposed to get an update from the landing radar. We couldn't go below 13,000 feet. That came in only at the last minute. So there were a lot of, you know, little nervous things that kept you awake all the way down until you landed. But then you're there, you say, well, I'm going to take off for a couple of days, so let's relax and enjoy it. And I was going about the little chores of getting ready, and it came to a rest period, and then looked up at the Earth for the first time, really seeing it in the black sky, the blue planet all by itself up there. And that was an emotional moment for me as well. I think certainly some of the emotion was as a result of having successfully arrived, a little sense of relief there. But most of us, I think all of us in our way, have expressed the same kind of feeling. Seeing the Earth, even though it's 4 times as large as the moon, still it looks fragile. Still it looks small. You think it's pretty big when you're back there among your friends and it's 25,000 miles around and so on. But from that distance, you realize it is in fact fragile. It is in fact a small part only of our solar system, much less the rest of the universe. And I think all of us have expressed that. Some perhaps with more political overtones than others, to the degree where maybe if people had a chance to see this, they wouldn't be so parochial, they wouldn't be so interested in their own particular territories. That will come in time, I think. I think people, perhaps we could take the Security Council and put them on the space station and let them try to see where their little bailiwick is. And that, you know, those things will come in time, I think. But to me, and I think to all of us, it was a realization that it is finite, it is small, it is fragile, and we need to start thinking about how to take care of it. First plane ride was in a homemade glider my buddy and I built, and fortunately we didn't get more than 4 feet off the ground because it crashed. But first legitimate airplane ride was when I was working at the local airport, and as a reward, partial reward for my activities, I was given a ride as a passenger. And after 2 or 3 of those, the same pilot, he gave me a chance to play with the controls, and that's when it really all started. I think my interest in aviation goes back to grade school, 9, 10, early teens, when Lindbergh made his flight. He was the big hero. I started building model airplanes. Later, in the early teens, I used to ride my bike every Saturday morning to the nearest airport, 10 miles away, push airplanes in and out of the hangars and clean up the hangars, get a free ride once in a while, get to hold the stick once in a while. And that's when my interest in aviation really started. Uh, at that particular point, there were really no aviation schools as they have nowadays. It was not a lot of commercial aviation. But a friend of my father's who was a graduate of Annapolis, we were talking about it one day, and he said, you know, little Alan is a fairly bright guy, and he could probably pass the entrance exams to the Naval Academy if he studied a little bit. And, you know, the Navy is just starting their air arm, and if he could go to the Naval Academy, then he could get flight training, and then he could become an aviator and use his talents. Well, the chap was right. I guess I did apply myself properly. I passed the entrance exams, got the appointment, and it just went from there. I thought I was pretty normal because we did chores around the farm. Got involved in my own newspaper route to make money to buy a bicycle. And toward the end of the fourth and fifth and sixth grades, I started building model airplanes. Of course, in our grade school in those days, there were no organized sports at all. We just went out and ran around the schoolyard for recess. No organized sports of any kind through the early grades. So I suppose I always felt I was pretty normal, and I did what I had to do around home and did what I had to do in school. I didn't mind studying. Of course, obviously math and the physical science subjects interested me more than maybe some of the more artistic subjects, but I think I was a pretty good student. Obviously, the teacher thought so. No, I didn't. Certainly when I was in the one-room country school you described, I guess my ambition at that point was to get through with a creditable performance. Really, of course, nobody thought about astronauts in those days, but I didn't even really start thinking about airplanes very much when I was in grade school. I saw that interest sort of came later on. But even in those days, a one-room country school with one teacher, 6 grades, was unusual. And I think it was because, of course, I came from a rural community, and that was the school of that particular day. I think it was beneficial to me because of the fact that one grade was not reciting continuously, obviously doing a little studying and so on. And so I think I learned more in the first grade about the second grade, and consequently I only spent 5 years there. Now I like to say I was smart enough to finish 6 grades in 5 years, but I think perhaps the teacher was just glad to get rid of me at that point. I would think the answer to that would have to be that one lady teacher in grade school, all 6 grades, one room, 25 students. She was about 9 feet tall, as I recall, and a very tough disciplinarian, always had the ruler ready to whack the knuckles if somebody got out of hand. And she just really ran a very well-disciplined group. And it's interesting. I think most of the youngsters responded to that. There were 1 or 2 that couldn't handle it, and obviously they dropped by the wayside. But that still sticks out in my mind. That's the lady that taught me how to study and really provided that kind of discipline, which is essentially still with me. I think certainly some of the characteristics which were helpful to me in the aviation business and the astronaut business were developed in those days. First of all, the home life. Came from a family of hard workers, achievers to certainly some degree in that small pond. And then the teacher. who was bigger than life itself and very strict in those days. And I think the sense of family and family achievement, plus the discipline which I received there from that one-room school, were really very helpful in what I did later on. Obviously, I was challenged by becoming a naval aviator, by landing aboard aircraft carriers and so on. But, you know, in those days I figured, well, I was just one of those guys that was doing his job, and maybe I could roll the airplane a little better than the next guy. But when I was selected, after my very first tour of squadron duty, to become one of the youngest candidates for the test pilot school, and all of a sudden I began to realize, hey, maybe you are a little bit better than somebody else, or maybe you're just doing your job better than the next guy. You may not have any extra talent, but maybe you're just paying more attention to what you're doing. And I really think that's when I realized that I was the sort of person that was objective enough and dedicated enough to do a good job. And of course, then the challenge to keep doing better and better, to fly the best test flight that anybody had ever flown, and obviously that led to my being recognized as one of the more experienced test pilots, and that led to the astronaut business. Well, as a matter of fact, that's kind of a cute little story, because at the same time the invitations to volunteer were sent out, there was an article in the New York Times that said 110 top military test pilots chosen by NASA to become space pioneers. And so I read the article, and I said, gosh, you know, I fulfill all these qualifications. I wonder where my invitation is. It was on a Friday afternoon, and no invitation. As a matter of fact, it was a rather miserable weekend until I found out first thing Monday morning that the mail had been misplaced in this Admiral staff where I was stationed at the time, and the telegram was delivered to me Monday morning. So it was kind of a weekend of saying, gosh, I wonder why they didn't choose me. Obviously, I'm highly qualified in these particular areas, but everything turned out fine, and we were given the opportunity to go to Washington, be briefed on the project of Man in Space, and given the opportunity to choose whether we wanted to get involved or not. And it was interesting that some of the chaps who were a little more mature, with the same qualifications, but were thinking more of their career in the Navy or the Air Force, military. And there were several who chose not to get involved, and I think not because of the fear of failure, but rather because it was a career deviation. As a matter of fact, we talked about some people being skeptic. When I was finally selected, made the finals, one of 7, NASA folks said, well, now, you'd better call your parents and let them know what you've been doing, because your name's going to be in the paper tomorrow. So I called, and Mother was delighted, but my father took the attitude, well, now, what is this you're going to do, son? Because he could see a deviation in a military career in which I'd been relatively successful up until that point. And even at that age, gosh, I was, 35 years old then, give or take. And when your old man says, you're going to do what, son? There's a little pause of reflection. Fortunately, in my case, he lived long enough to see me go to the moon and back. And one evening, we'd had dinner. The ladies had retired, and we were having a drink in front of the fire. And he said, do you remember when I said, what are you going to do, son? I said, yes, sir, I certainly do. And he said, well, I was wrong. I think she was all for it. Because, you know, being a test pilot isn't always the healthiest business in the world. And I'd been involved in testing off and on for 6 or 7 years and flying strange airplanes higher than faster than we could talk about in those days anyway. And having done it reasonably successfully, they say any landing you can walk away from is a good one, that sort of thing. I think she knew immediately that I would volunteer for her. All of us trained so that we were probably in the best physical condition we'd ever been in up until that point. Beyond that, in the early days, we all were given certain areas of responsibility. For example, because of my naval background, I was assigned to be responsive to the engineers on naval recovery in the water, contingencies, what do you do if the thing sinks, that sort of stuff. Others were involved in the tracking system. Others were involved in propulsion systems of the rocket as a specialty area. And we worked with the engineers in the design and construction and testing phases in those various areas. And then we get back together at the end of the week and brief each other as to what had gone on. So even though we were there competing with each other for the first ride, we were still acting as a team and helping each other in those days. I don't know. And the chap who made the final decision, Bob Gilruth, who was a director of the Manned Spacecraft Center in those days, has never told me. He just said that, well, you just were the right guy at the right time. And I guess that's how it all happened. I was the right guy at the right time. Or do anything else you want to do. I'm a firm believer in that, obviously. And there's certainly a message here for me still, because using the days in space as an example, we were not always successful. And when I say we, I mean the NASA team. There were two really serious lapses of concentration, a little bit of overconfidence perhaps, a little bit of lack of attention to duty, some little insidious things that happened. You've got this great team of dedicated, qualified people, but yet they get a little bit complacent. And boom, pretty soon something goes wrong. That's always been a good lesson to me, that you've got to do the very best you can all the time. Now, you can't always do that, but you can always try to recognize when you are goofing off and get back on track. It's a very insidious kind of thing, but if you look for the signals, they're there. If you're a little bit late for work, leave a little bit early. I don't have to do that tonight because I can do it tomorrow. These are the signs that I'm talking about, and they eventually lead to bad decisions. They eventually lead to lack of performance. And if you really want to do something, you've got to keep analyzing yourself so you don't fall into that little insidious trap, and you don't get back on your heels, and you don't get complacent, because there are a lot of people out there that are going to run right over you on the way to the same target. Well, it was sort of a last-minute decision, and the reason behind it was that there was some belief that the escape tower might not separate from the top of the spacecraft. But then you get down to 25,000 feet or so down at terminal velocity, and you're not going to be able to get the parachutes out because the escape tower is still on. So he said, well, let's go ahead. We'll put a little chest pack right there. And we practiced, there was enough time to hook the chest pack on, undo the straps, open the door, jump out, and come down the personal parachute. It was just a tertiary means of getting out. A lot of times people have said over the years, boy, you really must have been scared. And you say, no, fortunately I wasn't scared. Nervous, but not frightened to death, because if you have a person there who's petrified, he's not going to be any good as a pilot, as a backup, as an observer, whatever his function is going to be. There has to be a belief, a dedication to training, to the point where you're just absolutely not panicked. It's similar only to the degree that we were able to design into the system that a certain movement of the stick was going to give you some kind of a familiar response in the instruments, because it didn't fly like an airplane. You didn't have any kind of a feedback of the faster you went, the more difficult it was to move the stick and that sort of thing. So really, although the way the pilot looked at his cues of attitude and speed and orientation and so on and responded like he would do from the same cues in an airplane, it just didn't, was no way it flew the same. And the simulators showed us that. They showed us that we just had to forget about thinking about wingtips and looking out through the nose of the airplane, that sort of thing. It just wasn't going to be that. I had the opportunity to be with him on several occasions before he died. A couple of times at the White House, state dinner type functions, and then perhaps the most memorable visit with him was really spontaneous. It was prior to the launch of Apollo 11, which we all know was the first lunar landing, and I was there with my family in the VIP section, standing off by myself, just sort of reflecting on what had happened and what would happen. And this gentleman came up in rough clothes with a sailor hat turned upside down and introduced himself. Of course, I knew right away who he was. And we had about 30 minutes of recollecting what he had done and what that had meant to early aviation. Well, I think we talked more in terms of them being pioneering efforts. Of course, nowadays we call it research, pushing out the frontiers, but recognizing that the contributions of those early days of aviation, and like with me, the early days of space, what it meant to the general public when these new innovative airplanes or new innovative spacecraft and the brains that developed them, the science that was developed from that, and how that filtered into everybody's everyday life. And interestingly enough, it was about at that point where he was becoming interested in the interaction between technology and the environment. You may recall that that was the thrust of his of the later years of his life, and we talked about that a little bit too. But it was a very exciting thing for me to have the opportunity to be with him and one-on-one like that, talking about our favorite subjects. And fortunately, my girls were there, and they had a chance to meet him also. So it was a very memorable day for us, as well as for Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Mike Collins. I have never really felt, except perhaps at moments like this when it's obvious in retrospect that I did make some historical contributions. During the actual process of flying spacecraft or flying the Spirit of St. Louis, one doesn't think of oneself as being a hero or a historical figure. One does it because the challenge is there, and one feels reasonably qualified to accomplish it. And it's later on, I suppose, perhaps at the suggestion of other people that say, well, yes, maybe I must admit, maybe I am a piece of history after all. Oh, absolutely, but not from the standpoint of contribution to history, from the standpoint of an individual response to a challenge, which, of course, in our case, was a highly technical challenge. And I think in the early days, particularly, we didn't ever envision ourselves as receiving the attention and publicity which we did, because there were a lot of skeptics in the early days of the space business. Half the people thought it was exciting and rather positive, and the other half thought that generally we were fairly crazy to be doing that sort of thing. So I think in the early days, and this is probably a lesson. There's probably a lesson there in that if a person shows up to fly an airplane or a spacecraft or to conduct some surgical technique, then, or to be the greatest lawyer in a certain field, then he has to be there because it's a challenge to him personally. He knows he can do a good job, and he can't be thinking of whether he's going to be a hero or whether he's going to be a bum as a result of what he's doing. In other words, a person to be successful, I think, has to be there because he knows he's equipped to do a job, he's challenged by the job, and that's really the reason why he's there. We had a ball up there because everything was essentially the way we had envisioned it. Everything was essentially the way we had practiced for it. We laughed and giggled and bounced around, and I think almost everybody did. The only problem that the old man had was we didn't have that fancy little car. You know, the first 3 flights had to walk with a little golf cart, and they had assigned us a landing area close to a fairly large crater about a mile away, which had about a 15-degree slope as you approach the top of it. And it was sort of like trying to climb a sand dune in the desert. I guess you take one step and your foot slips back. And so it really got physically to be difficult for us. Finally, we just picked up the golf cart and carried it up the hill rather than try to drag it over the rocks. So that was a little bit of a surprise. Also, we had a difficulty in defining the rim of the crater to which we were supposed to walk. And I think the problem there was that because of the shadows, it appeared in the photographs to be a very sharp rim, where, as a matter of fact, over millions of billions of years of meteorites, it was fairly well rounded. So we didn't actually recognize it as being a precipitous type of. Although we were there at the rim, we collected samples from the ejected boulders. You didn't realize that we were specifically right there at it. But outside of that, we got everything accomplished. All the samples, obviously, of course, we landed closer than any of the other 5 landings, and we brought back the oldest rocks. You know how those things are. I was really very pleased, and at the end of the second mission, I played with a little device that I had received clearance to play with before, and that was a makeshift golf club. Whacked a couple of golf balls up there. All of us wanted to try to think of something which would interest perhaps young people primarily in the difference in the gravity. The gravity is only 1/6. The lack of atmosphere. There's absolutely a total vacuum up there. And some of the other guys, the clever guys before us, had dropped the little lead ball and the feather and watched them slowly proceed at exactly the same rate to the surface. And so some imagination had been used before. And I, being a golfer, thought, well, now, if I could just get a club up there and get it going through the ball at the same speed, that it was going to go 6 times as far as it should have gone here on the earth. So I set about, we designed a club head to fit on a handle which we had up there to scoop up dust samples with, and I cleared it with the powers that be. We practiced in a spacesuit before we went to be sure there were no safety implications. And the deal I made in the final analysis with the boss was that if things were kind of messed up on the surface, then I wouldn't play with it, because obviously we'd be accused of being too frivolous. But if things had gone well, which they did, then the last thing I was going to do before climbing up the ladder to come home was to whack these 2 golf balls, which I did, and I folded up the collapsible golf club and brought it back with me. The golf balls are still up there. Perhaps the youngsters of today will go up and play golf with them sometime 25 or 30 years from now. I didn't volunteer to become a hero. And I certainly think in the early days, none of us realized what the positive response would be with respect to those of us who were the first to fly, the first to orbit, the first to land on the moon. There have been a handful of us, of course, that have been singled out because we were the first to whatever. Becoming a public figure overnight was a little difficult at first, I guess. First of all, it was because I hadn't really expected it. Then all of a sudden realizing that people who wanted autographs didn't always ask at the right time, that they weren't always polite, that they sort of, I guess in our case, figured we were public property because they were taxpayers and we appreciated their contributions, but I mean, then I had a little difficulty with that. Then I one day was looking at some film, which was the presentation of a medal from President Kennedy to me in the Rose Garden, and I made a few brief remarks afterward, and I said in a sense it was really not because of my individual effort, but really because of the efforts of the dedicated people that had worked with us on the program over the years. And I said, you know, you really meant that when you said that, and I think that if you really appreciate what these people have done, then you will respond with a very positive image to what degree of attention and adulation you're getting. At that point, from there on out, it's been relatively easy for me to understand why it's happened and to try to be reasonably positively responsive to it. Well, when I say we, I speak of my wife, and I have always tried to explain to the girls, even when I had to go off on 9-month cruises in the Mediterranean or in the Pacific, why I was doing it and what it was all about, that I felt that I could contribute to the military. It's a favorite family story that we still laugh about. I had my wife and the 3 girls aboard ship one night, dinner in the officers' mess, and of course everything, the white tablecloths and the silver and the stewards and the whole thing. And I was on duty that night, so when they left, I still stayed on board. And one of the girls said, they were writing back, they said, "Mommy, how come Daddy is so rich and we're so poor?" But we always tried to share experiences with them. It was a little more difficult for them after the astronaut business, I think. But they've responded well. All 3 are happily married with their youngsters, and they're all 3, kind of gung-ho little girls. They're not just happy homemakers. They are, of course, but they're all involved in little projects of their own because they're challenged by wanting to help local charities or wanting to start a business or things like that. I think they've turned out reasonably well. Well, if it's the one thing, obviously it had to have been being selected to make the first manned space flight for the United States. That was competition at its best. And I say this again, not because of the fame that recognition that came with it, but because of the fact that the world's best, America's best test pilots have been pre-selected, selection process, so and so, and down to 7 guys, and of those 7, I was the first one to go, and that has to be, always will be, I guess, most satisfying thing for me. Well, I would think I would have to say that they have to know deep down inside that it's something that they really want to do themselves. It's not to please mommy or daddy, not to please Uncle Harry, because he did this or daddy did that. And those pressures may eventually lead the individual to decide within themselves that that's what they really want to do. That has to be there. And it has to be because you know you're qualified to do it, and if you apply yourself, you can do it. And again, if there is going to be fame or fortune involved, you can't do it for those purposes, because if you do it for fame, if you do it for fortune, they're both very bad appetites, because you never get enough of fame or you never get enough of fortune. But if you do it as an objective, then you reach the point where for the moment you're satisfied, and that gives you the confidence to go on to the next objective. That's what I would say to young people. Let me make a little pitch. It's been interesting over the years in talking to the average layman about space. And of course, there's always the initial interest and the excitement, and so you go through how exciting it was, because it was exciting to them as well as to us. And then some perhaps more perceptive people say, well, now, really, what was the value of going to the moon? When you strip away all the excitement and glamour, how about this millions of dollars we spent sending you up there? And I said, well, now, wait a minute. You realize that I went to the moon and back, and I didn't leave a single dollar up there. And they said, well, now, where did all these millions of dollars? And I said, every single dollar that was spent on the space program went into the pockets of the individuals who worked on it. The contractors, the subcontractors, the vendors. They said, oh. And I said, yeah, they went to feed their children, put clothes on their back, send them to school. He said, yeah, I guess that's right. That's what. But how about all this high-tech stuff that you left up there? And I said, well, yeah, we had some pretty sophisticated materials up there. But you probably couldn't get 5 cents on the dollar for them today. However, the people who developed that are still here on the earth, and the research, the development, the techniques that they developed for that are here, and that's being used today to improve your communications, satellite communications, so on and so forth. I said, oh, yeah. So the real value of this is technology. They said, well, that's fine, but let's take it one step further, says I. The one thing that we do in the United States today, better than any other country in the world still, is to build a better mousetrap. Our level of technology is still better than the Soviets by far, better than the Japanese, surprisingly enough. We still build that better mousetrap. And if we're going to be the leaders of the world, if we're going to worry about trade balance, if we're going to worry about perhaps military systems, or perhaps solving the problems of the environment, we're going to have to continue to spend money on research, medical research as well. We do that best, and I think it's important for youngsters who have a bent toward technology and science not to get sidetracked in the high-paying jobs like lawyers and doctors, brokers, and so on. That's important. But there's still a need for any youngster who has any scientific interest at all to continue the lead that we have in technology in the world today, if we're interested in the future of the United States. Well, I really hadn't thought too much about it. Of course, we've traveled a lot. We've seen the whole world from a distance. I've seen a lot of some beautiful countries. I've seen, of course, artifacts, the pyramids, Great Wall. I suppose maybe the top of Mount Everest might be a neat place to go sometime. if I didn't have to climb up there. If I could just all of a sudden be put on the top of Mount Everest, that'd be pretty exciting.